Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today for the Women in STEM webinar. This is presented in partnership with Witty and with Robert Half Technology on behalf of 451 Research. Today I'm going to be presenting results from a survey that we did a few quarters ago about women in technology and what the driving forces are there, how do we get more women in technology, and frankly drive towards parity. I will be presenting the results. This is Broderick from 451 Research. I am a research director here overseeing some primary research efforts and researching colocation as well. So just to set the tone and kind of before we get into the study results, I wanted to spend a little bit of time level setting. What is the status of women in STEM overall? Kind of where do we stand today, and what does the future look like for all of us? And so just a few quick stats. At a top level, only 14 of today's Fortune 500 CEOs are women. And so that's not specific to STEM, but it's just kind of a leadership check-in that definitely not at half there, right, which would be 250. For general workforce, women are the majority of the workforce at about 57%. However, in engineering and computer science, very below 50%. So it's about 13% in engineering and 25% in computer science. I think the question here is, how do we drive towards parity there? How do we get more women interested in engineering and computer and mathematical sciences? In terms of the pipeline that we've got going here, if you look at bachelor degrees that are being handed out in the United States, women here also are the majority of people who are getting degrees, which is great in terms of overall education. But only 8% of those that are graduating are getting degrees in computer science, and only 19% of those in engineering. And so if you're looking at the pipeline and if the problem's getting better kind of on its own, you can see that the data doesn't actually prove that out. In fact, it's just kind of staying steady. When we surveyed the Witty members, kind of getting to the survey results a little bit here, on average, when we asked respondents who are women in a STEM field or working at a STEM firm, the average was only about 26% of their colleagues that are female at the same level with the organization. And so once you get out into the workforce, it continues to be the case that women just aren't at parity. I think this is a problem in lots of different ways, but one of them that I'm going to choose to highlight is that there was a recent McKinsey study that was carried out on a global level. If women reach parity in terms of salary and then also just representation in different fields, you could add about $12 trillion to global GDP, which is a huge, huge change. They also found that more diverse companies, this is true of gender and ethnicity, are more likely to get returns above the industry average. In fact, ethnic and gender diversity, they found to be a competitive differentiator, and that it would actually shift market share toward more diverse firms. So lots of excellent kind of correlation there, if not causation, that points to the fact that whether you're a woman in STEM or a manager at a STEM firm, there are lots of reasons why you would want kind of parity at all levels. So a little bit more about the study that we carried out. There were some various goals here. We wanted to better understand what we can do. We know the kind of the problem statement that I had just laid out, but as companies in STEM, as individuals participating in STEM, as people kind of in general, how can we help out with this issue? So the first thing that we wanted to do was better quantify what the experience is. You know, what's happening today at a deeper level besides just those top-line statistics, and also get a baseline that we could benchmark ourselves against and measure satisfaction for STEM as a career for women. The next thing that we wanted to do after kind of quantifying the problem was learn tangible ways, some real ways that we could increase women in STEM, both in the pipeline and then also in companies in general. Lastly, we wanted to do something that we're actually doing right now, which is to educate organizations and individuals on some, tangible, real ways that you could retain female STEM talent and capture all of those upsides that I just mentioned in terms of financial returns, market share, and just increasing overall global GDP. So what we did was we decided to work with one of our partners, WITI, which stands for Women Technology International. It's an excellent partner organization of ours. It's about 27 years old, and they have over 2 million members globally. So we worked in partnership with them and surveyed their members. This survey was fielded between April and May of 2016, so from Q2 16. And we got over 1,100 respondents, which is far exceeded our expectations. There's a nice sample size here. I know when I'm looking at results from a study, it's very helpful to know who the typical respondent is. And so when we're looking at all of the rest of the results from this study, we wanted to get into a little bit first, who were the types of women that we were speaking with. First off, in your upper left, these are established organizations. About 80% of them are over 15 years old. So these are mostly not kind of startup organizations. In terms of operations for location, so this isn't where the organization is necessarily located, it's where they have operations. There's a pretty good distribution here. Most have operations in North America, but then you can see the spread between Western Europe, Asia, Eastern Europe, etc. In terms of job title level, mostly it's middle management, so almost a third have the title quote-unquote manager, which includes senior manager, associate manager, all of those sorts of things. Another thing that's pretty important in terms of demographics here is the respondent's age. There are a lot of data points in here that actually are pretty generational, and so things are kind of changing on their own as it evolves. What we see here is that the majority of respondents are 50 years old or above. One other thing just to mention in terms of kind of women in STEM and the survey here is that, I'll just speak up here. There was a question asking me to speak up. I will do that. Is that these women work in STEM organizations, STEM-focused organizations, so an IT firm, a science and technology firm, or they're in a STEM role at another firm. So I am, just as an example, someone that's working in a lab at Procter & Gamble. And so, just getting onto the survey results here, I believe there are kind of two lenses to put on this issue of women in STEM. The first one is building a pipeline. And so to get more women in STEM, we need to prepare more women for a career in STEM. This goes back to the earlier issue about bachelor's degrees and making sure that women are realize it's an option earlier and that they could be educated in these areas. And so the first part of the presentation, we're just going to take a look at how do we build that pipeline, how do we get interest earlier, and instill confidence that people can succeed here. First off, we asked about when that kind of interest in STEM begins. And so one way of looking at this is by when the decision is made to take an initial interest in STEM. And you can see that almost half of respondents decided on STEM in grades K through 12. And so there's a lot of work that could be done here around curriculum and targeting younger girls, frankly, to consider STEM, to have an interest in science and IT, mechanics and engineering, all of those fields. I think also it needs to be normalized, right? Women should get telescopes and microscopes when they're little, and Legos and all of those things just should be normalized for little girls. Also, I think throughout all stages, mentorship and setting examples should really be encouraged. And just making sure that there are role models, right? I think that's also part of the normalization issue, and just making sure that all women realize that they could be practicing kind of in that STEM area. About half also make their decisions at the college graduate school level or after their education is complete. And so another thing that we asked about in this study was when the decision is made, but also what influences the decision. And so why do women and young girls decide to enter into a STEM field? When we asked about that, it's interesting, like most people I know,
Women want to be good at their job. They want to have something that they're interested in. They want to be compensated well, and they want to be in a field that's growing, which makes perfect sense. Financial considerations tend to be more important later in life. We're going to show that in just a second. There's no reason, though, that guidance counselors and other kind of people of influential posts couldn't mention earlier that compensation is strong, right, in STEM. We can be honest about that and mention it kind of at the high school level, let's say. Of note, those with aptitude or interest were more likely to have a father or both parents working in STEM. And so there is kind of a parental issue here and kind of a generational issue where women who are exposed to STEM earlier are more likely to feel like they have an aptitude or an interest for the STEM field. In fact, when we looked at this sample of Woody folks, about 50% had fathers who worked in a STEM field. And so it's very encouraging on the personal front. I think it's also something to consider when creating outreach programs, mentorship programs, is maybe to target those who don't already have exposure to STEM from a parent or another role model. Like I said, just looking at when the decision is made versus what impacts the decision. For those in K through 12, remember that's the largest group, about half of women in STEM show a natural aptitude, interest, and actually encouragement plays a much higher role for those that are younger girls. So there we're looking for curriculum issues and just kind of experiments that we could do to show how interesting STEM can be, right? I'm thinking of things that I did growing up, like the egg drop or coding, making your own website, having race car races go down hills, creating trebuchets, or other sorts of kind of experiments, that make science and tech fun and interesting and cool, frankly. Financial reasons, like I said, pop more later in life. There's no reason, though, that we can't mention that earlier, right, especially in the K through 12 stage when people are choosing their majors for college. Like we saw earlier, although women represent 57% of those that are getting bachelor degrees in the U.S. today, it's in the 19% that are focusing on math and engineering. It's pretty low. One other interesting point is that of the respondents who decided later in life that they were going to focus on STEM, they actually feel more successful financially than the rest of the group. Of those that decided earlier in kind of that K through 12 group, they feel more knowledgeable and kind of successful in their knowledge and their contribution to their organization. So there's a tie here between how folks are choosing to enter STEM and then also in terms of their success later. So tying together the building of the pipeline and also retention. It's important for women and everyone to feel successful in the roles that they're in, both in terms of finances, knowledgeable, personal fulfillment, all different aspects. But there are ties there between how someone chooses a field and then also how they feel successful in their roles later in life. Another kind of issue here for building the pipeline is looking at the home front, right? It's important too, and it's a little bit more complicated, of course, to change. And so when we look at women in STEM, kind of the first step is to have women working outside the home. You can see there's a clear generational shift here. I'm looking at the left. And so we asked respondents to tell us by their ages, were they raised thinking that women have the choice to work at home or to work outside the home? Were they raised thinking that women should work externally or women should stay at home? And you can see for respondents that are over 60, it's 14% of them that were raised thinking that women should stay at home, versus for those that are under 40, it's only 6%. And you see a big push there, kind of the growing piece, are those that are raised thinking that women should work externally. And so there's kind of a natural progression happening, mostly within the U.S., about expecting women to work outside the home, which will, in turn, hopefully, proportionally, help get more women into STEM roles. There's some interesting issues also when you look at this data by race. Latino respondents, Black respondents, Asian American respondents, and white. Nearly half, or 43%, of the African American respondents grew up believing that women should work outside the home. And so a big strength there in terms of that ethnicity, just generally thinking about women working outside the home. These cultural norms have a huge impact, of course. When women are encouraged to stay at home, when they were raised thinking that women should stay at home, 90% of those respondents had never met a woman who was working in STEM growing up. They didn't have any role models. And so another way of kind of targeting or looking at these girls growing up and kind of which programs we should focus more on perhaps are those that are raised thinking that women should stay at home. We also need to consider ethnicity in lots of different ways. And like I said, if their parents are already working in STEM. I mentioned mentorship earlier. Obviously, having role models, having mentors around, very important. This is just looking at professional mentorship. As a follow-up, if anybody wants to know, we did ask about academic mentorship as well. The good news is that it's very successful, frankly. Most women mentor, most women receive mentorship. And so about 72% of the women in STEM respondents had a mentor, have served as a mentor, and 57% have been mentored by someone else. And so the net here is that more give than receive, right? More giving mentorship than receiving mentorship, which is excellent. Most women mentor both men and women. So in terms of who they're choosing to kind of be a mentee or who they're working with in that way, mostly it's both men and women. There is a slight preference for women, though. So women are choosing other women to mentor. When receiving mentorship, again, mostly it's both, but there is a slight preference for men being the mentor. And so this may just be due to demographics, right? We already covered that men are by far the majority in STEM roles in the workplace. So if you're looking for a mentor, maybe it just makes sense that you end up with a man just in terms of the numbers. But I think it's encouraging here, right, that lots of women are serving as a professional mentor. Many are being mentored by other women and men. I think this is a very positive sign, and we need to keep this up and kind of keep this going. The second kind of half of the problem that I mentioned, and I don't think this gets as much play, maybe it should, is keeping women in STEM. We need to not just build a great pipeline, but we need to have women stay in STEM and not switch fields or drop out of the labor force entirely, right? How do we keep this going and not just build a pipeline only to have it kind of fall apart once women start their careers? Okay. So the first thing is the idea that women want to be promoted. Women want to move up the chain, if you will. The data backs this very clearly. Today, we asked about their current job title for respondents. We loosely grouped it into these categories of C-suite, VP, entrepreneur, director, manager, etc. We realize that these things vary quite a bit by organization, but about 13% of the respondents are currently at the vice president or C-suite level. And so that includes associate vice president, senior vice president, all sorts of C-level titles. Then we asked respondents about their goal title, right? So where do you ultimately want to end up? So including the entrepreneur category, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, that number balloons from 13% to 44%. And so almost half of all women want to be in charge in some way, right, at work. They are looking for advancement, and so how do we help them reach those levels? In fact, another kind of ethnicity note here was that 57% of African American respondents wanted to be at the vice president or C-suite level, which was higher than any other ethnicity. Pretty interesting. Lessening the gap at the top also will provide more role models for younger women as well, right? So there's a cyclicality issue here where getting more women at the top provides those role models, right, at least in a very public way. The entrepreneur issue is pretty interesting. We didn't actually give that as an option, but there were so many respondents that wrote that in, that they wanted to start their own business. They wanted to go and work with a startup, that we decided to kind of categorize it separately. And so there is a very strong also entrepreneurial spirit here among women in STEM, which is great. So how do we get women up that career ladder? What helps them? What hurts them? How do we encourage more kind of forward progress there? What we see here is we asked respondents, they could choose multiple here. What was a helpful factor in your career and what was a hurtful factor, right? The top three helpful, you can see, were their managers, their direct managers. We all know that having a great manager makes the job a lot easier. Just continuing education in the form of reading books, reading articles, and then lastly, networking in the form of professional groups. Hurtful ones were a lack of opportunity, a lack of salary knowledge, and just, gender discrimination, straight up discrimination. Especially if you bundle together gender discrimination and other forms of discrimination there, it's a pretty scary number. So to get more women at the top, we really need to kind of help those helpful factors and address the hurtful ones. On addressing the hurtful ones, obviously we need to pay attention to equal pay for women. For discrimination, more training, awareness is needed. Hopefully also over time this will diminish. And also just getting more women moving up the ladder, of course, will help. Another kind of issue here we were investigating in terms of keeping women in STEM careers is making sure that they feel whatever is important to them that they are successful in, right, and that there aren't any kind of gaps. And so we took a look at the percentage of respondents who rated on a 0 through 10 scale these aspects. You can see them along the x-axis in terms of importance, right? So the way to read this is that 85% of respondents said that personal aspects of their role was very important to them. And so personal here, very interestingly, does not mean kind of job flexibility or family life work balance. What it means is personal fulfillment, so having an impact on the world. So when you get up and go to work every day, that you are having kind of a meaningful, positive impact. You can see where the gaps are, right? So for example, in flexibility, 69% of respondents feel it's very important. 64% of respondents feel they're very successful at it. And so another way of looking at that, we asked how many of your companies have flex work policies. So in terms of hours, in terms of location where you're working, 81% of the companies did. Of those companies that had those policies, we all know that doesn't mean you're necessarily using the policy. 90% of those respondents do take advantage of those programs. So for the average respondent, flexibility is an issue that largely has been resolved. They're taking advantage of it. They feel they're successful at it, and it's largely been addressed. Of course, that's not for every organization, but on average, that's the case. One area where you can see there's a very large gap is in terms of opportunity. This doesn't necessarily mean promotion. It just means having a chance to work on those big projects and work with those big clients, right? Women need to be given the opportunity more, and perhaps even ask for the opportunity more, right? Just a couple of other interesting notes here. White women were more likely to feel they've been successful in terms of opportunity. So that number, instead of 35%, is about 43% for white women. Latina women are more likely to feel that they've been successful in terms of respect and employability. So that respect number, instead of 62, it's 77 for them. And employability, on average, instead of 55%, it's about 68% for the average Latina respondent. The good news is there are some areas that we need to improve, right? I think opportunity is the top one that we see here overall. However, we asked in general, as a woman in STEM, would you recommend STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, to other women as a career path? And 81% of them said they would. And so that's a pretty helpful number in a bunch of ways. What it means is 19% wouldn't, so we need to kind of figure out why that is. But also it's helpful as a benchmark, right? Hopefully we see that number go up over time. So one other kind of view here, I think we've talked a lot about programs that we can all be involved with, mentorship, maybe curriculum changes and broader systemic changes. But as an employer, how do you keep women longer? And as a field, as you know, STEM as a field, how do we keep women? And so another view here is looking at the tenure with the current employer and how do we make that longer? You can see on that upper left the split of the typical tenure with their current employer for respondents. The average there is about 7 years. About 50% of folks are currently looking for another job. And so that includes, you know, the constantly, currently, and then in the soon future. About half of them are planning on staying put where they are now. When we asked folks if they would have stayed longer, if they had had more opportunities for advancement, was the way we asked it, would they have stayed? And half of people said yes. And so we asked, how long would you have stayed? And it was about 10 years, right? So one way of getting women to stay at your organization longer, to get more diversity, to reach those better financial returns, more market share, you know, it's better all around, is to just have more opportunities for advancement, right? When women were looking for other roles, about 3/4 of them said that they would stay in the STEM field, and about 1/4 of them said they weren't going to, or they were unsure. So we need to work on the margins there, not only with the pipeline, but also with keeping women in the STEM field and also making sure that they feel they have opportunities for advancement. I think this is an issue for managers in organizations to fight for their female employees to have equal opportunities, and then also for women in STEM generally to perhaps ask for more opportunities. So looking at departures, of those that are leaving, we asked why. And there are some troubling issues here around age in particular. We can see that there's some ageism evident here. When you look at respondents who are under 50 years old, remember that's about half the sample of the study, we asked why they left their most recent role to look for their current one. And you can see that the biggest category here is that they're looking for greener pastures. They're looking for better long-term prospects. For those that are over 50 years old, it's a different reason. About 1/3 of them left that role because they were laid off. And so that includes women who retired, were just let go, were reorged out of their position. The company maybe was sold. There are lots of kind of potential things that go into that bucket. One thing I can see looking at this, and I think a key kind of recommendation from this study, is that HR, human resources, and management need to look at when they're reorganizing or doing layoffs, how does that look in terms of lots of different lenses, but a couple of them could be gender and age, right? Let's make sure that we're not having any kind of prejudices or biases creep into that process. One other thing is kind of what about what we're doing right now? What about this webinar? What about conferences that we all go to? Are they effective? Is this helping the problem? The good news is that the majority say yes, it is helpful. It's not so much actually due to the content, though. A lot of it is due to networking, right? So this is about networking opportunities. This is about techniques for the workplace, and also just kind of general camaraderie and community building. That's kind of the main reason that these programs are effective for women that attend them. On the negative side, why are they not effective for those that feel that way? Because the content is lacking. So these slides, this information would be lacking. But another key one, if you add these together, is that it's not applicable to me or it's not available near me. And so this points to a couple of potential issues for programs like this. One of them is that we're not getting the word out like we should, right? That people feel it's not available when maybe it is, either virtually or in person. or that it's not applicable, and then maybe that's an issue of programming and kind of the content around it, right? Making sure that women feel included and men feel included in the conversation. So just to kind of wrap it up, and then we'll take some Q&A, just a couple of points to kind of close with. As I mentioned earlier, women are not at parity in STEM, and I think that's to the detriment of a lot of different groups, but one of them are the companies themselves that employ women in STEM. McKinsey, like I said, has found that it is not beneficial for the company. Diversity in terms of ethnicity and gender are both materially, financially helpful for companies. And so we decided to carry out this study, survey a bunch of women in STEM and see kind of benchmarks in data that we all could take back with us and hopefully do future studies on, and then also come up with some recommendations of what we can do as individuals, what we can do as companies, what we can do as institutions, right, to improve this issue. I think the first thing is more kind of focused on the pipeline. We need more mentorship programs. We need to normalize women in STEM, I think, even more. These programs need to emphasize aptitude and interest. That's what we're seeing as being very important across all ranges. Job training needs to be an important part of education in schools, I think particularly for younger women. Let's make this concrete. Let's make it real. There were lots of experiments that I mentioned. I think also just emphasizing the financial upside, right, to choosing STEM, quite frankly. I think organizations like WITI, like 451 Research, we can all create some best practices and some awareness around these programs, what we should be emphasizing, and who we should perhaps be targeting more so than others based on background and other issues. From the company perspective, check in with your employees as a manager, as human resources. Do they feel they have opportunities for advancement? I think a crucial piece here of retaining women in these organizations in general is making sure they feel they know what their career path is, right? If I do X, Y, and Z, then I will be qualified for the next step here, right? If I learn these skills or show these capabilities, then that gets me to the next level. I think that sort of communication is really key. Women's needs have evolved too, right? What we saw in the success versus kind of what it feels important kind of chart there is that we need to move beyond flexibility on average. We need HR involved. Women want the same opportunities that everyone else does, right? Compensation, they want to feel capable, and they want respect. I think we're doing the right thing just by talking about this today, and thank you for joining us today. I think we need to keep the conversation going. We need more studies like this one. Hopefully we'll carry out more studies like this one just to see how we're doing and how we get away from the flat growth, frankly, that we're seeing in women in STEM. There's just really no growth there. One potential way of participating, I just wanted to add in a shout out here for our own Global Digital Infrastructure Alliance. There's a link up here, but membership here is about kind of IT research in general. You all are welcome to join and apply to be a member. It's really a great kind of community and group where we do a lot of kind of knowledge sharing about IT in general. Another way of getting in touch, or if you can't capture the link right now, is just to email me or my colleagues at 451. We'll get you in touch. And like I said, I'd really like to keep the conversation going. So, without further ado, let's see if we have some questions here. Let me just go through the feed. Mostly kind of some technical questions here. Ooh, here's one. This person asked about how they can help. So what are kind of concrete ways in my daily life that I can help bring about more women in STEM? I think one way, if you're someone working in a STEM field, is to get involved in mentoring. I think whether your organization has a formal program or it's informal, I think those are some really kind of great ways to do that. Mentoring for women in particular. Another thing is to volunteer, right? There are lots of nonprofit and for-profit organizations that work on teaching women coding, different science skills, different experiments that we can carry out, right? Getting involved with those organizations is a great way to go forward. I think those are two kind of pretty concrete ways. And another thing is, if you are a manager or if you're in human resources, is to be aware of those biases, right, that we talked about, especially in terms of layoffs. We saw some pretty scary numbers there, especially around age for women, and also making sure that all of your employees feel like they know what the next steps are, right, what the kind of plan is for them as an employee. We have one other question about next steps for this study for this presentation. So we're going to be giving this presentation next week again in Las Vegas. I'm going to change it a little bit, keep it interesting, at our conference called the Hosting and Cloud Transformation Summit. So we will be there, and I'll be there if any of you would like to chat in person. And if you do want more information about that conference, feel free to email me. Like I said, Whitty is a wonderful, excellent partner of ours, and so we hope to carry out more studies like this with that organization. And with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you for your participation in the study, if you did participate. Thank you very much.